everyone, and welcome to today's episode on cybersecurity. I'm so delighted to be joined today by Director of Cybersecurity Insights at Verve Industrial Protection, Ron Brash. Thank you for joining. How are you today?
I'm great, Harsha. Thanks for having me on the show.
Thank you so much. And before we start this, one question that I always ask my guest, tell us about your career journey.
Oh, I love this one. I wish I could say it was linear. I went to school, I got a job. It kind of has been that way. It's not typical because cybersecurity and industrial wasn't really a thing when I went to school quite some time ago. Something in excess of a decade now, when I think about it. My career is a bit different than other people's because I grew up with industrial families. So my family was basically an entrepreneur, but they were the #1 fuels agency for Chevron in North America. So that's Canada and the United States.
Yeah.
So I grew up with the blue collar mentality of cutting down trees, fueling up boats for industrial or commercial fishing, large volumes of fuel, keep it running, don't break it, schedule when you're going to do work because of fishing seasons. And I understood it very differently than everybody else.
Yeah.
Few people realize I actually wanted to go to school for art, but that doesn't pay. So I used my creative talents for working with systems and understanding vulnerabilities and looking at the big picture. And I lend a lot of credit to my art teacher for that because she recognized that art wasn't really my thing. I loved it, but I could use it in other ways. And she kind of explored that with me. And I got to give her a lot of credit for that. What I did though, is I started off with a community program that was, I don't know if it exists anymore, but I was taking university courses before I finished high school for programming.
Okay.
And I graduated school very, very young in comparison to most people. I was 17 versus 18. So when I finished my high school, I already had basically a first half of a semester done for a regular diploma. So I did a diploma in applied technology. And I was really curious on breaking things. And I started using Linux. I think it was Fedora 5 at the time, maybe even 4. So it kind of dates when I was starting this, and I kept using Linux. And then I started working for a company called Tofino Security, which at the time was the only industrial cybersecurity firewall that was doing deep packet inspection. So for stuff like Modbus or Ethernet IP or various other protocols. And I worked for them for about 6.5 years. Worked on a bunch of OEM projects for some of the top tier vendors in this field. I won't name any of them, but you can find out quickly enough. And then we were acquired by a large Fortune 800 called Belden, which typically is known for cabling, but they have a very large industrial base for products. From that, I kind of resigned and I went and did a master's in computer science. And my thesis was on secure technology transitions for industrial networks. So very similar to doing, I was actually focusing on using SDN to the curb, basically, because you can't convert the legacy devices, but you can go SDN to the cabinet, basically. And while I was doing my master's, I ran a consultancy for 3 years in Montreal. And it was quite successful, but unfortunately, a certain president came into power in the United States and scared away all of my customers. So that kind of killed that successful startup, even though revenue is doubling every year, but I can't compete to global economics. So what I did was I looked around and I had some friends at a Big Four and I talked to a few people. I wanted to know what to do and how did they print money basically. And I went into it with a different mindset. It wasn't for me, don't get me wrong, but I was there for a bit. I learned a lot of stuff doing assessments for very large companies on OT sites. And then what I did was I moved out of that and I jumped over to Verve Industrial Protection as their director. And there I do a lot of research, thought leadership speaking. I do a little bit of a preemptive product development as well. So when we need to onboard or integrate a new device, often that device will be passed over to me with a bunch of supporting information. And I will more or less reverse engineer it or basically dissect it into a way that we can use it into our product. Sometimes I do end up publishing vulnerabilities. I wish I had more time to do so, but generally speaking, it's we're working on behalf of the customer to solve their problems from a very technical perspective. So that's
Yes, but yeah, that's interesting because knowledge always comes handy in one way or the other. Yes, and you have such a vast experience in OT environment. We have seen penetration testing in IT environment, and that's a very common thing. Now we are seeing assessments in OT environment are also picking up, and you have done so many assessments in OT environment, and you know the IT and the OT environment are very different, the way they operate, irrespective of the underlying technologies. So what are some of the common threats that you have seen that exist in OT environment?
Oh, I
And
wish.
to our audience, OT is operational technology.
Sure. So I'll set the bit more on that for some people. So
Yeah.
operational technology is a term that Gartner created to describe something that before was just known as industrial control systems, or so
Mhm.
something that was very kind of vague. Uh, and I don't know why, but some analysts thought that that was a good idea. And I think there's actually a third group, which is the industrial control system side, which is the layer deeper than just
Yes.
operational technology. When people say operational technology, it often more or less means IT systems or commodity based systems, as I call them, that provide OT functionality. So that would be like, for example, if you're in a building management system and you have elevators that have those little advertising screens on them that are running Windows CE or Windows XP often
Mm-hmm.
enough, and you think, some people might say, oh, that's kind of OT. Yes, you are correct, but it's not the thing that controls the elevator.
Yeah.
And that's a very different discussion. Or for example, um, if you take an organization like Honda, which was recently had a ransomware attack, and it did
Mhm.
affect a bunch of their subsidiaries and other groups that were affiliated to them to deliver what contractually they were obligated to do. And Honda, however they got in, I won't go into the debate of how they got in and what I've heard and what I know, but their OT systems were affected by an IT-based ransomware. So what that means is their operations, so delivery of trucks, delivery of parts, or manufacturing orders on the lineups or conveyor belts, whatever have you, they were unable to be completed because an IT system went down, and that IT system affected OT. So there is like a bit of a convolution of how we look at this stuff, and so far there's very few attacks on true OT or true ICS,
Mhm. Mhm.
but those are rare. But I do think there will be more of them. But again, the consequences are harder, and so is the investment. And criminals are like
Yes.
everybody else, where they're quite lazy. So to answer the most obvious threats, I would say, I took some notes to kind of keep it nice and short. I think the biggest threat to OT is actually the lack of proper software engineering in many products is probably the biggest threat to itself inherently. And instead of just the software engineering, it's the age of the products. The products are deployed. Let's say an aircraft is around for 20, 25 years, if not sometimes more. An elevator in a building might be around for a long time. HVAC
Yes.
is
Mhm.
around for a long time, and that's your air inside of your building. So people don't realize it's got a long lifetime. It's not like a cell phone where sometimes I'm lucky to get 2 years out of it before it lights on fire and is dead. That's a very different concept. So I think that lack of engineering in the product itself, but also the lack of engineering to implement the solution and protect it in the first place, that cash up
Yeah.
front saves you long
Mhm.
term. That mentality for some reason was forgotten, and humans got lazy being engineers. We forgot that technology requires engineering. I don't know where this happened. Maybe it was with this focus on convenience. I don't know probably somewhere in the 80s this happened,
Mhm.
or maybe early 90s. But that's kind of what I think is one of the big risks. And again, that lack of engineering, if you take most software vulnerabilities, 80% of them approximately, I'm kind of making that number to the wind, but most vulnerabilities are a lack of proper engineering. Did you sanitize your fields? Did you check to see if you were within bounds? Sometimes
Mhm.
it's very difficult writing complex stuff, but we've known to double check memory in C for decades now. Why aren't we doing that with web applications? I don't understand. So there's a lot of, it's like people were being lazy and cutting corners. So the business world has also put us at risk and convenience. Remote access and connectivity to the internet is obviously one of the prime places where everyone gets in.
Mhm.
If you leave RDP, sessions open because people are
Mhm.
lazy, they're not using what we call jump boxes, which is a machine inside of a demilitarized zone
Yeah.
where you get into it. It's usually secure. I'll say usually, although we've not been finding that, but that
Yeah.
ideally would be secure. That'd be like a Citrix server or a terminal server, and from there you go into the environments.
Including. Yes.
That's that's one approach to making a more secure group, but you still need to also take that approach and make it secure too, and harden it. But once you get inside of these environments, the world's your oyster. So if you can get yourself inside of a cabinet or a wind turbine in the middle of nowhere, chances are once you're inside of the wind turbine, you can actually go backwards towards the enterprise environment and no one will stop you. There's probably nothing stopping you. So that's another aspect that I think is a risk. Is there's a physical aspect to it. There's that soft shell inside. It's a false sense of security. That's a huge threat. But I'm probably contrary to some of the cybersecurity groups, because I see cybersecurity as a Ouroboros, the snake eating itself. So to feed the industry, you find vulnerabilities. And it's this ever-ending loop where you're selling the remediation of it versus looking at something very pragmatic. Or, if we're taking oil and gas or we're taking something else, there are clear costs to cybersecurity. It's a cost sink. And so that needs to be needs to be managed just the way that you do maintenance on anything, like your car or your heat pump for your house. You make educated discussions about how you maintain it. For a car, you change the tires regularly. If you don't, well, you run the risk of blowing a tire or having no traction and going off into the bushes when it rains. So you're making a lot of conscious decisions, but we don't do that for some reason for computers very well. We don't prioritize maintenance. Like, for example, when you get your maintenance book for your car, it says at 100,000 kilometers, you do X, or at 200,000, you change the timing belt. There's or a timing chain. You do a lot of things that you don't realize, but for computers, I don't know why this has never been kind of mandated the way it is in a car manual. And a building manual should be the same. When you build a building, that's what you get, and you have to do it. Cybersecurity insurance, I think, will also change this, but for other risks, I don't see APTs and those world state groups as huge threats, for depending on who you are, of course, but generally speaking, most criminal groups are lazy. Like I said earlier, they're lazy and they're smaller and they're opportunists. So if they see something that's wide open and they think, and maybe with a little bit of effort, they say, oh, that guy's got some money, or that hospital's got some cash, I can get cash out of them because they need to be up and running. That's just like racketeering in many third world countries, where they hold up a shop because they know that shop owner has a little bit of money. It's no different. And naval pirates are also very similar to that. They would attack the one that wouldn't attack them back. So it's very, I wouldn't say it's so crazy to imagine, yes, there is nation state groups. There is, I'm not denying that, but I think the scope of it isn't as crazy as people think. It's not hackers in hoodies and, very Hollywood. The general sense that I have from what I see and all of the readings, most groups are not invested enough to go find 0 days. They will use older exploits. And that's the true risk to OT, is because they have these older vulnerabilities that are unmitigated and unremediated. They are able to exploit them with very minimal cost to themselves, right? I go buy a piece of, ransomware off of a bazaar on the dark web. I weaponize it. I make money for almost no effort. That's something that people don't think about, but that's the way it's going, and that's the way it is right now. So, or you obfuscate a malware that's old, and no one will detect it because of the nature of antivirus. And so, it's a commodity of scale and demand problem, more so than the creative juices required to do the true spirit of hacking. So I think that's a huge risk. Now, I do think that one day someone's going to start ransoming hardware, and that's going to be a very interesting day.
Yes, but I agree to you. The age is a major factor, because when you put, for example, a building automation system or an elevator system in a building, that stays there for 20 years. When the maintenance cycle comes up, they maintain the elevator cable car, the elevator mechanical system, building automation system, but no one pays attention to the computer that runs the software to control these systems. So that's the major factor that needs to be addressed. As part of the maintenance cycle, someone needs to look on the maintenance of that system that runs the software. So that's a very interesting area that you uncovered. Now comes the mitigation. So
The fun part.
yeah, I know that that's altogether a Pandora box, but like, what are some of the practical ways to manage and mitigate the risk? Like, some easy tips that you can share that can help to manage and mitigate the risk in the OD environment.
Sure, sure. So I'll set the record. I don't believe what we call ripping and replacing is an option. I
Mm-hmm.
don't think it's cost effective to replace an elevator in an old building or
Yes.
changing the software. So this is a big barrier to those that don't understand, for example, how it works. It would be like trying to buy, it would be like buying a new car just because a newer model came out and yours is old. It doesn't make
Mm-hmm.
sense
Yeah.
unless you have that sort of disposable income. And typically building owners and OT environments do not have that type of disposable
Oh,
revenue
yes.
kicking around. So, so what you have to do is you have to think practical. What can I do that reduces the risk to those environments? You can never eliminate the threat itself, but you can reduce the likelihood of it. And hopefully someone else gets attacked and not you. So basically you're not the easiest target. For let's say, let's keep using the example of a building. Often they're probably very flat networked. Everything can talk to everything. So your
Yes.
thermostats could theoretically talk to your elevator, and your elevator could talk to the way that your air intake is in the building, and your air conditioners. In theory, if we have a smart lead style building,
Mm-hmm.
one of the first things you'd want to do is do a quick, it's relatively low cost and it can have a high return on investment, which would be segment your networks and use
Mm-hmm.
managed switches versus unmanaged switches. So then you can separate your traffic, at least logically, with virtual LANs, and you could get a lot of things out of it. If you do things like MAC filtering, because these environments are what we are called very steady state, there shouldn't be new systems going in and out of them, so you can filter the MAC addresses on them. You get a side benefit of, if you're using, let's say, Cisco gear or another vendor, it'll generate an alert, and you can have that alert go into your IT SIEM if you wished. And that would
Yes.
kick off, and you'd have like kind of a anonymous, you'd actually have a passive detection tool for free. And then you'd
Mm-hmm.
also be able to detect what we call rogue devices, or if your maintenance guy is
Yes.
doing something, or there's a case in Montreal from a few years ago, and I won't say which retailer, but there was a security guard from one of the top security companies that was plugging in a Raspberry Pi, and it was misconfigured and issuing DHCP on the retailer's industrial plant floor.
Okay.
It took down all of their retails, and it was actually a rotating schedule, so it was very hard for them to find the security guard plugging in a Raspberry Pi. And and it was a male, I think he just wanted to watch Netflix most likely and not do anything bad, to act as like a bit of a proxy to get outwards. I think that's what he was doing from what I've been told. So you're helping people be honest, right? It's like why you put locks on things. You help honest people be honest. I think that's a good way. So networking, security, and integrating and managing those critical assets and segmenting your networks is a key function. The other
Absolutely.
the other one is, maybe you can't patch them, fine, but at least you can harden them a bit, right? You could turn off extra services. So if you have a Windows machine there that's sitting like a kiosk, maybe it shouldn't have the printer services put on or
Mm-hmm.
enabled. So there's a bunch of activities you could do. And then you also want to be able to inventory all those assets. So if something does happen, what firmware versions are they going? So I can make educated decisions about fixing
Mm-hmm.
stuff. So if I know the firmware revision of those switches and they're end of life and I can't get a new one, okay, maybe that's on my list of things I should buy in the next 2 years because I know it's a planned obsolescence.
Yeah.
And so you can make more strategic maintenance decisions versus a cybersecurity decision about how you manage it.
Yeah.
It's a engineering out the risk approach. So that's one way. The other one is, if you can't patch, what do you do? So protect access, monitor for changes. Again, these are very steady state facilities, so you should get a good idea of how it should operate, except for maybe during busy maintenance windows. A building probably doesn't have busy maintenance windows, but an oil
Mm-hmm.
refinery does. So
Yeah.
you'll see a lot of churn in your events and how things are going. Remote access is probably one of the biggest things. If you can, focus on the right technologies to do your secure remote access. Also keep track of the remote systems that are talking over your remote access. So you and I are on our laptops from home under these current conditions. Don't trust our laptops to bring them into those environments after COVID is done, right? They
Yeah.
should be erased or new issued laptops. That's something I consider as well. I've used this thing for a bunch of my personal items, nothing excessive, of course, but looking at Ars Technica or whatever, I don't know if I've gotten something on it or whatever. So the idea is to not have that type of stuff go into those environments with an
Yes.
unsafe machine. So
Yeah.
that's one aspect that I would say is a remediation. Double check and make sure your stuff is clean before you take it in.
Yes.
Again, it's very, very tricky. There's a bunch of stuff. So if you have machines, because they're very steady state, use application whitelisting. No one should be able to install anything. Office and Outlook probably won't be on many of these building automation systems,
Yeah.
but they might be in some OT environments because it's a standard image for the organization. Make sure they're not there. Hardened golden images, as we like to call them. That also aids in your recovery process.
Yeah.
Focus on prevention and mostly recovery versus the other five elements in the NIST CSF, for example. That's another great practical piece of advice because you have two places to detect when an issue has occurred. At the very initial part, where you're seeing someone probing you and getting access or failed login attempts,
Yeah.
or you're seeing it after when it's already occurred.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
Absolutely.
what good is it to see that ransomware is propagating on your network and generating alarms when it's out of control? It's a fire sale.
Yes.
So I like to tell people to focus on the recovery aspects and the prevention, and hopefully and assuming that you have the right processes and training and cyber fire drills, you will be okay because your downtime won't be 24 hours or a month. It'll be 8 hours because
Yes.
you've been able to contain it to a certain network. You've been able to contain it to a certain set of devices or Windows systems. You have adequate, secure offline backups, and you have all of the other stuff to make it go around. So that's kind of my advice in a sense.
Yes.
I also tell people to invest in making RFPs have cybersecurity language in them.
That's really important. Yes.
It is, and we're seeing some requests coming in from that. And in my previous lives, I've advised people to actually have that language in their RFPs.
Yes. Yes.
I mean, you can't make it perfect, but you can offer a reasonable level of security.
Yes, at least you should start somewhere to put the language, and I also have a list of inventory, know what's there, and I agree to your point because what we have seen in some of the cases that the applications and the services that are not needed for the environment are on the ports that you don't need. Like in some of the cases, you don't need a remote access, but RDP port is enabled. So make sure what you don't need, shut down, and what you need, just keep and monitor, which is really good and is more of a best practice to manage the environment.
Yeah. Now, in some environments, though, like let's say we're taking electricity, right, and it's governed by NERC those requirements. So you actually want to have less in the first place because it reduces your compliance efforts on your own.
Yeah.
Your patch management that is mandatory, that you have to prove evidence for. I would say that would also be true for PCI if you're doing credit card stuff. So I think that this is a great path forward, and people don't realize is that sometimes you do more effort up front and it saves you long term, not just in resource costs, but just in the remediation of all this stuff. So if you do things up front, like RFP language, and getting a device that's relatively secure from the vendor or the integrator in this case, most likely, and then validating said integrator's work, because never trust but validate. That's a key piece. I think that I think some organizations are starting to awaken to. Most are still in the initial frenzies and shock of, oh my gosh, I have something I need to do, and they don't know what to do.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, those were really useful insights. So before we sign off, parting comments for fresh graduates who are looking to make a career move in cybersecurity.
So I believe cybersecurity is multi-domain and multi-discipline. So when you get a degree in cybersecurity, and just cybersecurity, you only know a small fraction of the pie. You don't know, for example, the computer science necessarily aspects of it, the programming, why a file system works that way, where the risks are, and maybe you don't need to. But if you're working on industrial and OT systems, you do need to know a lot of those aspects because, for example, I can't apply traditional patching and IT management to an embedded solution. Why? Well, if I was an electrical engineer or an embedded systems programmer, I would know exactly why and which types of cybersecurity that I can apply to those systems, why they're used in that way. It gives you extra context. So I wish that more people spent more time studying domains that are adjacent to what they're doing. because cybersecurity won't teach you, computer science won't teach you everything about cybersecurity. Electrical engineering teaches you nothing about cybersecurity generally,
Yes.
but yet they're all weirdly related. And that's, I think,
Mhm.
a critical piece that I think fresh grads need to keep in mind is just because what you learned at school you think prepares you for your job doesn't mean you should stop learning and growing, because that's the real value that will keep, that will keep you employed as you go along.
Yes.
And if you work in a startup, you have to wear all hats anyways. So,
Oh, yes.
or a smaller company, or when, let's say, there's layoffs and there's less people and you're required to do 3 jobs, well, you can at least raise your hand and say, I know something,
I know.
and then
Yeah.
you will still have a job and be very invaluable.
Yes.
It also informs your discussions, I think, in a better way, and allows you to interact with more people, which isn't a bad thing either. So I like that. I wouldn't say also, if you're in cybersecurity and you're really technical, to not invest your time in, let's say, business functions or learning how to speak or to do presentations. Communication is key. So again, that's that breadth requirements that a lot of schools and institutions don't promote. And
Mm-hmm.
it's your responsibility as a graduate or as a student is to question that and to push your own initiatives and take charge of your own career. And along that same sense of taking charge of your career, a lot of people don't realize they need to build their own brand. That doesn't mean toot your own horn and promote yourself in that way. What it means is, think of it like a researcher. If a researcher is unable to communicate what they've found in a sane way, then their research is no good to anybody.
Yes.
But if they're able to communicate that in a way of, this is why this is important and here's what you need to do, in a wider audience, even generalizing it for different audiences, right? Because not all audiences are the same to each other. That's a very important part of establishing yourself as someone that really knows what they're doing, or at
Mm-hmm.
least knows who can help them deal with their problems, right? They know to
Yes.
come to you and then you can help them solve them. I think that's critical. People are also, I consider myself as a product. So if you consider yourself as a product, what do I do? What do I solve? And if you look at yourself like that, it changes the way that you approach your careers, your jobs, all those things. So I think that's a very important part that people forget. It's not just go to
Mm-hmm.
school and get a job.
Yes.
You don't deserve one just because you went to school. You need to prove it to a certain extent. And once you've proven it, chances are, once you've proven it, you have a brand already.
Yes.
People do work with you because they know who you are and they don't care where you work. So if I change jobs tomorrow, that won't happen, just in case my bosses are listening. But if that's the case, my customers or people that I know will follow me to my next job.
Yeah.
They're doing business with me and doing, working with me on problems versus working necessarily with my employer. And that's very important that organizations also recognize this. You can't hide everyone under your, we are all one company brand. Sometimes it doesn't work very well. It
Yeah. Yeah.
stifles certain people. But I think individuals, they shouldn't take, they should be questioning, they should be challenging in a democratic fashion. But I think that's a very critical piece that people forget, and also to get involved in stuff that's outside of your wheelhouse,
Yeah. Yeah.
right? If you're a computer science person and you're focused on big data, well, maybe figure out the IoT systems that generate that data that you're using, right? I think that's very important because you'll understand, okay, I can't ask for the world because that IoT device would then become basically a PC.
Yes.
Oh, okay. So, there's cost discussions in there. There's little chips in there and there's all of this stuff. And then people say, oh, okay, now I get it. So I think it's up to people to really understand, and not everyone wants to be a master craftsman. Don't get me
Mm-hmm.
wrong. But I think if that's your goal, to be at the top of your field or to be, very solid at what you do, you need to be very proud and passionate about this,
True.
and
Absolutely.
break the box, basically.
Yes. Yes. Like expand your horizon, challenge yourself, and just try to gain as much knowledge as you can.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, Ron, thank you so much for sharing valuable insights. It's been a pleasure to have.
Thank you. I haven't thought